Hey, thanks for checking out our services here at Meeting Place. If these services have been a help to you and you'd like to help us out financially, that would be awesome. You can do that via PayPal just using our email address, meetingplacebangor@gmail.com. If you could help us out, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.
Reading today is from Mark 8:22 to 33. When they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and heal him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Then, spitting on the man's eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything now?" The man looked around. "Yes," he said. "I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around." Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and his eyes were opened. His sight was completely restored, and he could see everything clearly. Jesus sent him away, saying, "Don't go back into the village on your way home." Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" Well, they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other prophets." Then he asked him, "But who do you say I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, then reprimanded Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's."
Thanks, Kirk, for that reading. Have you ever been mistaken for somebody else? Somebody come up to you and call you by a name, and you say, "Oh, that's not me." It can be funny sometimes. It can be humorous. It can be embarrassing other times if they're identifying with you with somebody you'd rather not be identified with. It can be dangerous sometimes. Sometimes police misidentify or mistake a victim for a criminal, and oftentimes victims have been killed because of a case of mistaken identity. So the text for today includes a couple cases, I think, of mistaken identity. We begin with this first text where they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man. Just a point of information, the Greek text doesn't have a gender for this person. Almost all translations identify him as a man, the blind person, but he's actually genderless in the text. So some people bring a blind person to Jesus, and they beg him to touch him. He took the blind person by the hand, and he led him out of the village. I think that's important. This person begins following Jesus, or Jesus begins leading him, and he takes him out of the cultural center. We've seen a lot in Mark this lectionary year that things quite often happen outside the community, out in the wilderness and so forth. So Jesus, again, brings this man out of the village, and when he had put saliva on his eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man, or the person, looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on the person again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not go into the village." So after the first time Jesus touches this man, he's partially healed. But he mistakenly identifies people as trees walking. Superficially, this is a story about Jesus healing a blind person. And it takes 2 tries to get this blind person's vision working correctly. The first attempt gives the blind person some partial sight, but it takes a second attempt in order to help him to see everything clearly. Now, while I don't doubt that this is an account of an actual physical healing, I don't think we should limit our understanding of this story just to an account of a physical healing of a blind person. Mark is the only person that recounts this story in the Gospels. So the story could also be understood metaphorically, with sight representing or being a metaphor for understanding or comprehension. Like when you say, oh, I see, when you're trying to understand something, we can kind of interchange those two concepts, right? That when we encounter Jesus and he begins leading us by the hand, we will begin to see and understand things that we haven't seen or understood before, but that we're very likely to misidentify some of those things that we're starting to comprehend, that will only partially be healed. And in this state of partial hearing or partial understanding, we're likely to misunderstand exactly what we're starting to see, because trees don't really walk around like people, right? In other words, when we begin following Jesus, we will be prone to committing acts of mistaken identity. We'll start to see things in ways that we hadn't seen them before, but we're prone to not understanding completely what we're seeing. And we need a second, and maybe many additional encounters with Jesus before we really start to see everything clearly. Mark tells this story, and he tells it just before this next story in the story world of Mark's gospel. Jesus went, so this happened in Bethsaida, a small community. Then Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answer him, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." So up to this point, Jesus has been ministering throughout Galilee, mostly in small communities and mostly outside those small communities, except that he goes into the synagogues and teaches. These are rural communities that have no great political significance. But now he's on the way to Caesarea Philippi, and the name should clue us that this is a significant political city. Caesarea means Caesar, and Philippi refers to the Herodian King Philip, who built the city in honor of Caesar. So Jesus is starting to make his way into the significant political, cultural centers of the region. And as he's taking his disciples there, he asks them this question about his identity. Who do people say that I am? I think it's important that we keep the context in mind, that as they're heading toward a political center, he's asking his disciples to identify who people think he is. They tell him who people think he is, and then he asks a second question, okay, then, who do you say that I am? And Peter, with his famous answer, is, "You are the Messiah." But then Jesus sternly orders them not to tell anyone about him. Up to this point, the disciples in Mark's gospel, the disciples have only called Jesus teacher, rabbi in some of the translations. Rabbi just means teacher. Now Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah or Christ. Messiah is the Hebrew, Christ is the Greek. So they're interchangeable words. It really means anointed king. Whether in Hebrew or in Greek, Christ or Messiah means anointed king. But as soon as Peter makes this ID of Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ, Jesus sternly orders his disciples not to tell anybody about him. In Matthew's account, Jesus actually commends Peter at this point and says, you didn't get this knowledge by yourself. The Father in heaven has revealed this to you. But Mark has Jesus abruptly and sternly ordering them not to reveal this identity, his identity as Messiah or Christ, to anybody else. I think it's important that we see that Jesus didn't rebuke Peter for identifying him as the Christ. He rebukes or orders them not to tell anyone about him being the Christ. Like, he's not rejecting the title Christ. He's simply saying, okay, and in Matthew's gospel he actually commends Peter for making this realization, but don't tell anybody. Why would he not want to tell anybody that? I used to just think, well, he didn't want people to know he was the Messiah yet. But there's more to it. The Greek word here that's translated in the NRSV ordered, he sternly ordered them not to tell anybody, Jesus has used before in Mark's gospel. And we talked about this a few weeks ago in Mark 1, when Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, and a man with an unclean spirit came, and he cried out, What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, Be silent and come out of him. So that word rebuked there is translated from the same Greek word that later, in today's text, when it says Jesus ordered them not to tell anybody about who he was. Same word here. So here Jesus is silencing an unclean spirit for calling him the Holy One of God. And in Mark 8, today's text, Jesus silences disciples using the same word when Peter identifies him as the Messiah. Now, when we talked about this passage a few weeks ago, it was in Epiphany, fourth week of Epiphany, we noted that Holy One of God was a common priestly title originating with Aaron, and it was how people referred to the priests in the synagogues in the temple. And if you remember, I read this Robert Hamilton Kelly quote. The man with the unclean spirit misidentifies Jesus as the center of the scapegoating establishment, calling him by the priestly title, Holy One of God, and suggesting that he has nothing in common with the outcasts, but belongs with the teaching establishment of the synagogue. Jesus silences the demon not because he wishes to keep the messianic secret, but because the demon has deliberately misidentified him as part of the sacrificial establishment. A case of mistaken identity, again. This demonic man tries to associate Jesus and identify him with the ruling hierarchy of the sacrificial synagogue establishment, but Jesus won't have it. He silences him. Something similar, I think, is going on now when Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ. Herman Watjean of San Francisco Theological Seminary writes this about this. The Messiah or Christ title, as its history indicates, is essentially elitist. It denotes a king who is seated at the pinnacle of the socioeconomic pyramid over which he rules. To perpetuate his reign, he maintains an army, he collects taxes, and supports a temple that is serviced by a priesthood committed to the preservation of the divine order of his rule. So this term, or this title, Christ or Messiah, historically speaking at the time, was understood as a king who is seated at the pinnacle of the socioeconomic pyramid. When you talked about the Christ or the Messiah, that's what people thought. A king who sits atop the socioeconomic pyramid. And we've talked about this, the socioeconomic pyramid of the time looked like this. With Caesar at the pinnacle, Herod, Pilate, and Caiaphas, political and religious figures just below Caesar, ruling over this region. And then both the secular and the sacred side, which they didn't think of distinctly like we do. We tend to think of this church and state independently. They didn't think of it that way. They all thought that if you had risen to the pinnacle of this socioeconomic pyramid, it was because God wanted you there. And if you were on the bottom, it was because God wanted you there, right? So this is a whole way of thinking about the world, a whole way of thinking about reality and the structuring of societies. So in rebuking Peter in the same way and with the same language as Jesus had rebuked the unclean spirits in this man in chapter 1, was Jesus concerned that he not be understood as a Caesar or Christ figure in the way that they comprehended that title or that figure at the time? I think so. And I think we only have to continue reading to see why. So immediately after Peter makes this identification of Jesus as Caesar and Jesus silences him, he begins to teach them. And he says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. So just before, when he silenced Peter for making the confession that he's the Christ and tells him, don't tell anybody that, then he, without any silence, and openly, he teaches what's going to happen to him. He doesn't call himself the Messiah. or the Christ. He calls himself the Son of Man again. That's his favorite title for himself. And the description he gives is not of a king sitting atop the socioeconomic pyramid. Rather, the description he gives of Christ is of someone who will be rejected and killed by the people who sit atop that very socioeconomic pyramid. And he says this completely out in the open. He didn't want this to be a secret. He wanted anybody who could hear him to learn how he defined Christ. He didn't keep it secret how he was going to be treated by the people who sat at these higher levels on the socioeconomic pyramid. So Peter hears this teaching, and how does he respond to this? Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." So Peter rebukes Jesus for not being the kind of Messiah that he wanted him to be. Peter had got the title right, but he completely misunderstood the deeper meaning of that title. Or he misunderstood how Jesus was going to redefine the meaning of that title. Because really, it was how everybody thought about Christ and Messiah at the time. And Jesus was accepting the title, but he was, in his teaching and in the way he would live his life the next few months, would redefine what that means. And Jesus rebukes Peter for his misunderstanding, his misidentification, but he doesn't just rebuke him because he's wrong. He doesn't just say, "No, you're wrong, Peter." He calls him Satan. Isn't that a little over the top? Let's walk through it. So first, Peter correctly identifies Jesus as the Christ, but Jesus knows the historical and cultural meaning of Christ in their time and place, that they would think that means an elite kingly figure who would sit atop this socioeconomic pyramid that oppresses and excludes people. So Jesus then orders them not to tell anybody. This is because Jesus understands if they tell people that they see him as the Messiah, people will assume, oh, he's going to be this kind of a Messiah. And then third, Jesus tells them what Christ means. He teaches them that he will not kill others and establish an elite kingdom shaped by the socioeconomic pyramid they've all come to expect, that he will actually be killed by the leaders of that very socioeconomic pyramid. But he also tells them that he will be raised from the dead in 3 days. I mean, that should be a game changer, right? That should be like the aha moment. But it's like that goes straight over their head. They miss that part. They don't get that. This is their "I see men walking around like trees" moment. Like they're hearing something of what he's saying, but they miss the punchline. Jesus says, "Yeah, they're going to kill me, but I'm going to be raised from the dead in 3 days." It's as if they don't even hear that. And Peter rebukes him for saying that. I mean, if Peter had really thought this through and realized, oh, they're going to kill him, but he's going to come back from the dead, I mean, that changes everything, doesn't it? But this was so out there for them at this point, it's as if Jesus didn't even say it. Jesus had been leading them by the hand into understanding what the Messiah will do and be like, but it's as if they miss the conclusion of that whole teaching, that he'll be raised from the dead. So, number 4, Peter rebukes Jesus. Obviously, he didn't get that last line because he rebukes Jesus. I mean, he's not rebuking him from saying he's going to be raised from the dead, I don't think, unless Peter's thinking, oh, he's a little bit off his rocker, and I'm just going to ignore that last statement. But Jesus rebukes Jesus because he's not the kind of Messiah that Peter wants him to be. Then Jesus turns and rebukes Peter and calls him Satan. So it's here, I think, that we can begin to understand something about Satan. I don't think Jesus was saying that Peter was literally Satan. It was that Peter's expectations of him were, in fact, satanic expectations. That Peter's worldview was satanic. That Peter's understanding of reality was not of divine origin, but of human origin. So in this text, we see that Jesus makes an association between Satan and humanity. Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. I think the NLT that Kirk read this morning reversed that last sentence. He said, you are setting your mind on human things, not divine things. He puts the association between the satanic and the human right next to each other. So here, Jesus clearly associates the satanic with human things. This is why many scholars today are starting to understand Satan in anthropological terms, starting to understand Satan in human terms. Nowhere in Scripture do we see Satan or the devil doing something on his own. We never see a story about Satan appearing to somebody and doing something, right? Satan always needs a human agent. He always needs somebody to do his bidding, in other words. And humanity has structured itself in a particular way. This way. Even today, much of humanity is structured this way. Most societies structure themselves very similar to this pyramid that we've been looking at as we've been studying Mark. And I've put it here, and I'll read again this quote from Watjin. The Messiah or Christ title, as its history indicates, is essentially elitist. It denotes a king who is seated at the pinnacle of the socioeconomic pyramid over which he rules. To perpetuate his reign, he maintains an army. We see the army up there near the top. He collects taxes. We see the tax collectors. And supports a temple. We see that in the temple, the chief priests and all the attending Sadducees, priests, elders, and so forth. That is serviced by a priesthood committed to the preservation of the divine order of his rule. So Watjin's quote again describes how Peter and everyone else thought about the Christ and the Messiah. That he would not flatten out this unjust pyramid, but that he would simply place himself at the top of it and rearrange all the players underneath. It's why James and John would later ask if they could sit at the right and left hand of Jesus in his kingdom, because they were still thinking of a kingdom like this pyramid. But Jesus didn't come to validate and place himself atop this socioeconomic pyramid. He came to flatten it out, to bring the mountains down and the valleys up. So Jesus draws this direct line between this pyramid and Satan. Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And in this statement, Jesus, I think, draws a direct line between the socioeconomic structure that Peter expected him to put himself at the top of and Satan. You might even say that, in one way, this structure is the Satan. In one way, I'm not saying completely, but I'm saying in one particular way, this way of ordering human societies is at least satanic. Perhaps it is the Satan in some way. If we're thinking of Satan in anthropological terms, this is an anthropological diagram of how society is since the beginning, how we've arranged ourselves. This is the human ordering of the world that Peter wanted Jesus to place himself at the pinnacle of. And this is the human ordering of the world that the Son of Man refused to endorse. This is what, at his baptism, he washed his hands from, as you will, or washed off of himself. So I'm no longer going to associate with this. This human socioeconomic ordering of society is not divine. It is satanic. It is fueled by the idea that God blesses certain people with good health or wealth or lineage, and that God curses others. And like Peter Enns was pointing out today, in all of these stories in the Old Testament where the younger brother rises to prominence, all those stories serve to undermine this whole socioeconomic period. They're previews of what Jesus would ultimately try to get us to do. It's this structure that is maintained by exclusion and oppression. It's this structure that actually kills, steals, and destroys. So later in John, when Jesus describes the devil as the one who kills, steals, and destroys, this is a diagram of how that works. It is this structure that Jesus came to first reveal and then to tear down, right? So when Peter correctly identifies Jesus as the Messiah, he didn't understand what he was saying. It's like the famous line from The Princess Bride, "You keep using that word, but I don't think you know what it means." Right? Now, Barbara Brown Taylor, an author and historian, Christian writer, points out that this pyramid structure was what God wanted to deliver his people from all along, even in the Old Testament. The exodus out of Egypt was meant to be a deliverance from a literal pyramid society, a society that not only was structured in this particular pyramid way, but actually built its buildings in that structure to make it concrete, if you will. Now, remember when Moses had that encounter with God at the burning bush, God said, "Take off your shoes, Moses, because you're standing on holy ground." God met Moses not at the pinnacle of a pyramid. He met him on level ground. And God tells Moses to deliver his people out of this Egyptian pyramid culture. Moses was probably thinking, okay, then we can go out in the wilderness and build our own pyramid culture. But that's not what God said. He said, I'm going to lead them into a land of milk and honey, or I'm going to make them farmers. I'm not going to make them slave brick builders like that's what they know. I'm going to lead them completely out of that way of thinking about society. I'm going to lead them into a land of milk and honey. Well, who produces milk and honey? Agricultural people do that. There's nothing about any kind of a pyramid socioeconomic structure in the reason God leads Moses to lead his people out of bondage. Just abundance, with everyone working together on the ground, on the level. So Barbara Brown Taylor says this, in the Bible, the pyramid is prison, and freedom is being on the ground with God, farming. So deliverance out of Egypt was deliverance from making bricks in the service of Pharaoh, which upheld the unjust, oppressive pyramid structure of their society, to abundance as agricultural workers, all equal, all on level ground with God. Of course, the story doesn't play out just like that, right? The Hebrews decided they wanted a king like all the other nations. They wanted to sit atop the pyramid like all the other nations did. And God said, no, that's a really bad idea if you guys want to go that way. But they did it anyway. And they suffered under a succession of mostly bad, evil kings, all the way up until Jesus came. When Peter still wanted Jesus to be a political king, sitting atop another pyramid, but Jesus stops him from spreading that idea and begins teaching them out of their case of mistaken identity. So how does this speak to us today? I mean, we don't currently live in an agrarian society. So how should we interpret this kind of structuring of society? You know, we can sit here today, and I forget what the statistics are, but in the world, if you take the world population, I think something like 70 or 100 people own as much wealth as the rest of the world's population holds. If that's not a picture of that pyramid, I don't know what is. So I'm not necessarily talking about any particular country. I'm just saying the world has ordered itself in another pyramid structure. And so how are we to live in that? How are we to be in the world but not of the world? How can we think about that today? And any other thoughts about the message?